Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about this push towards cleaner energy. So, Alfred, what does it mean for nickel then, as we see perhaps more electric vehicles coming on?
I think that's a good point. Typically when you look at base metals and other things like, nickel, aluminum, steel, typically, people have looked towards, things like infrastructure built and whatnot for the demand for, things like nickel. But now with this EV, electric vehicles coming online, I think there's a good push towards things like nickel. So not just nickel, but things like steel, and things like aluminum. A lot of these electric vehicles are going to place a lot of demand in terms of demand for just base metals in general. So I think potentially where base metals in the past have been a little bit more economically sensitive, going with the ebbs and flows of economic growth. This is potentially an underlying story that potentially will drive the demand for base metals like nickel as well. So I think over the long haul, I think it is going to be supportive for nickel prices.
Okay. How does natural gas then fit in to this energy play?
I think, as I mentioned before, I think natural gas, it is going to be a huge, source of energy for, the economies in general. When you look at Europe, for example, Europe is heavily reliant on natural gas
Hmm.
and even just fossil fuels in general. I mean, we talked about oil, we talked about natural gas, and we talked about this push towards clean energy. I mean, a lot of the U.S., for example, has a target of moving towards, net zero emissions by 2050. China has 2060, and Europe has, I think, 2045 for a lot of different countries. So until we get there, we're still going to be very reliant on fossil fuels. Natural gas is very much a part of that. And as we know right now, a lot of the European nations, as they're very dependent on Russia in terms of natural gas supplies, Russia could potentially use that as a huge bargaining chip come fall and winter when temperatures get a lot cooler then.
Okay. Alfred, let's talk about gold. Because when I get asked what drives the price of gold higher, I always tell people, it's actually not one thing, which makes
Yeah.
predicting its price hard, right? A lot of people thought it was an inflation hedge. It's not really being reflected right now. What's Yeah? Can you talk about a little bit about gold, where you see prices headed, and what's being reflected right now in its price?
Sure. I think you could bring up a great point. I think when you think about gold, people always talk about gold and think about gold as, a hedge against so many different things, right? The way I think about it is it's a hedge against the weak US dollar, it's a hedge against inflation, and it's a hedge against macroeconomic or geopolitical risk. But it could change at any certain time. I mean, the usefulness as a hedge could be very dynamic, where sometimes traders and investors are using it for inflation. Sometimes it's more macroeconomic risk. Sometimes it's a US dollar. So, whereas a lot of people in 2020 were using gold as a hedge against macroeconomic risk, given what was going on with COVID, then we saw a transition into a lot of people using it as a hedge against inflation. But obviously, in the past couple of weeks and over the last month, it's faced a little bit of headwinds.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because the US dollar has been strengthening as the Fed continues to outpace other central banks, arguably other than Canada, in terms of raising rates and doing quantitative tightening as well.
So, for viewers watching, how should they fit gold into their portfolio? 'Cause I know there's lots of different ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you mentioned in previously, do you use it as a hedge against inflation? Is it a U.S. dollar? It's very hard to time. But what I will say is that over the long term, if you look at gold and if you say, if I use 5% of exposure to gold in my portfolio, whether it's through gold bullion or gold companies, it tends to be a great diversifier. It tends to reduce the risk in your portfolio. It tends to increase the long term returns as well, and it improves the long-term efficiencies of the portfolio. So overall, as I mentioned, very hard to time, but if you use it as a long-term core holding, 5% of the portfolio, it does improve the efficiency of the portfolio.
We only have about 40 seconds till the next break. Does it make sense to hold a gold ETF? And what do they need to think about?
I think so. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, prior to ETFs, it was very hard to get access to gold. It was either through closed-end fund or buying, gold bricks, which obviously are hard to store. But I think ETFs have really changed the game, where Now you could buy an ETF that basically just holds gold bullion in a vault for you somewhere, and it essentially trades like a stock. So it's very accessible and very easy to use and very easy for investors to understand how to trade it as well.